2010 was a great year in film, with plenty of variety. Audiences could either watch Leonardo DiCaprio struggle with feelings of guilt over his wife's death while constantly being haunted by the memory of her, or you could watch the same thing 5 months later. Inception was a project almost a decade in the making, and it was a story that Christopher Nolan was very passionate about. He had the basic idea of people entering others' dreams all the way back in 2001, but felt that he wasn't quite ready to tackle that concept just yet. After 3 smash hits in Batman Begins, The Prestige, and especially The Dark Knight though, Nolan knew he now had the experience necessary to bring his vision to life. Inception marked a shift in Nolan's career. Aside from Following and Memento, all of his films thus far had been based on another project, whether that be a movie, a comic, or a novel. And even in the case of Following and Memento, those didn't have a very large budget, so there's very little risk involved. Inception, on the other hand, is a blockbuster with a massive budget. It's also a wholly original story. It's not based on any other property. By not having a pre-established fan base for the project, Warner Bros. Were taking a huge risk. Why were they comfortable taking this gamble? Simply put, after the success of The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan had become a household name and a brand. They believed that the name Christopher Nolan had enough power behind it to draw an audience, and of course, they believed in the narrative as well. This faith would soon be rewarded, as Inception made over $800 million at the box office, and was favorably received critically as well. Many people today consider it to be Nolan's greatest film, and it commonly ranks as one of the greatest movies ever made. Some of Nolan's harshest critics claim, however, that Inception represents everything wrong with his filmmaking style. Others have even labeled it a ripoff of an anime released only 4 years earlier. How did Inception gain this controversial reputation? Did Nolan really steal the idea from an anime? And why is Inception often considered the quintessential Nolan movie? Today we'll be finding the answers to those questions, and in the coming months, I'll be diving into each film in Christopher Nolan's stellar filmography. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to subscribe. Now without further ado, let's get into the quintessential Nolan experience, Inception. Nolan claims that since his youth, he's had a fascination with dreams. This is what led him to write an 80-page treatment for Inception back in 2002 and present it to Warner Bros. As was previously mentioned, he felt he wasn't quite ready to tell such a story though, and decided to shelve it. After completing work on The Dark Knight, however, he knew now was the time. He spent 6 months completing the script, and after getting DiCaprio on board, spent even more time at rewriting the emotional beats of the story based on some suggestions from the actor. Speaking of DiCaprio, he was an actor that Nolan wanted to work with for years, and he finally got the opportunity with Inception. DiCaprio allegedly brought a lot to the role in regard to suggestions, but even in terms of just his on-screen performance, he did an incredible job. Other notable performances include Tom Hardy, Cillian Murphy, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and Marion Cotillard. Inception tells a very detailed and slightly convoluted story. Because of that, there wasn't much room within the narrative to flesh out each character in the cast, aside from the protagonist. Despite this, Tom Hardy's character, Eames, stands out from the rest. He has significantly more personality, as he doesn't take things nearly as seriously as the other characters. One moment that especially stuck out to me was Eames' conversation with Cobb in Mombasa. Seeing as this is his character introduction, we don't know much about Eames yet. However, in this one scene, we get everything we need to know, plus just a little extra. We learn just how skilled he is in this field, and the way he delivers the line about Fisher's relationship with his father has a layer of nuance to it. It almost seems to imply some kind of pensive reflection on Eames' part. Of course, we never learn anything about Eames' personal life, but the delivery of this line adds depth to his character. Another performance I enjoyed was that of Cillian Murphy as Robert Fisher. While Fisher starts off as your typical rich kid, as the characters literally go deeper into his psyche, he becomes far more vulnerable and human. And this culminates in the scene where he finally reconciles with his father. With how important this scene is to the story, it had to be done well. And fortunately, everything did come together for this moment of catharsis to have a full impact on the audience. And that's in no small part due to Cillian Murphy's performance. Joseph Gordon-Levitt also did a great job here. From an emotional complexity perspective, his character Arthur is one of the most straightforward in the cast. The reason this performance is notable though, is because of just how many stunts he did and the complexity of them. Apparently all but one stunt was done by Joseph Gordon-Levitt himself, and considering what these stunts entailed, that's incredibly impressive. Due to Nolan's preference for practical effects, a lot of what we see in Inception is exactly what was captured by the camera. Of course, for certain sequences, CGI was used, but even then, it was to a lesser extent than would be expected. One sequence that has always fascinated me is the fight in the hallway. This shot here is one of my favorites in any movie I've ever seen, and once I found out how it was accomplished, my admiration for it only grew. For the zero gravity section, they built an identical version of the hallway vertically so that they could suspend the actors with wires. And by actors, I mean Joseph Gordon-Levitt 90% of the time. For the gravity shifts in the hallway, though, they built a hallway that would spin so the actors would genuinely feel the effects of gravity. I'm not sure how else they could have accomplished this effect, but I was still surprised by just how much effort went into these scenes. These complex action sequences are often intercut with events going on in a different plane in the dream, so they never get stale or repetitive. This, of course, took tremendous effort on the part of editor Lee Smith, who had been working with Nolan for years. Nolan films have a tendency to be notoriously difficult to edit, whether that be due to him messing with time or having events take place in many different locations simultaneously. Inception falls in the latter camp. As our protagonists head further into the dream, events take place on all three planes, and these events aren't disconnected from each other either. Events taking place on the higher planes directly affect things on the lower ones. Due to this complexity, I feel it would have been very easy to make minor errors, or for the pacing to be inconsistent. However, neither issue is present in Inception. Although, as with any movie, if you have a keen eye, you can point out an error or two. The one complaint I do have in regard to pacing, and this doesn't fall on the editor, it's more of a story issue, is the sequence while the van is in freefall. Cobb specifically states that Arthur only has a couple minutes to create a kick. Arthur, in this 2-minute window, goes on to come up with a plan to create a kick in zero gravity, fights this guy in the hallway, takes the charges from the other room, which is on a different floor, goes back upstairs, wraps everyone up, brings them to the elevator, sets the charges on the elevator shaft, and then detonates them. Now, I believe the van was higher up than Cobb expected since there was an elevator on the bridge, but still, there's no way Arthur did all of this in 5 minutes, let alone 2. Either way, that's more of a nitpick than an actual plot hole. While yes, it probably isn't possible for him to have done all that, you could try and explain it away by just saying Arthur is really, really good at what he does. Moving on though, as is tradition with a Nolan project at this point, Wally Pfister served as cinematographer for Inception, and this was Nolan's most visually ambitious film yet. And once again, Wally Pfister delivered. There's the consistency and blockbuster quality that we've come to expect, and the larger-than-life elements are also captured in a way that impresses the audience, yet doesn't shatter our immersion within the narrative. In fact, a complaint I've seen about Inception is that the visuals aren't quite surreal enough for a movie about dreams. And while yes, the visuals are very grounded for the most part, I don't think that this is a legitimate complaint. Audiences are well within their right to expect more whimsical elements. However, Nolan was also well within his right to make a grounded story about dreams. It's just a preference thing at the end of the day. While the visuals are relatively grounded, the soundtrack is as epic and grand as can be. This is seriously one of the greatest scores I've ever heard. Hans Zimmer delivered a masterpiece here. Every single track fits the tone of the scene it's in, and it entirely makes some scenes. The final moments of this narrative are fantastic in their own right from a storytelling perspective, but the music pushes it over the edge to become one of the greatest final scenes in any film. We'll get further into that later though. Inception tells the story of dream thieves called extractors. They break into dreams and extract secrets from their targets. In fact, I believe the protagonist's name, Cobb, may have come from the burglar in Christopher Nolan's first project, Following. Either way, Cobb ends up being the most fleshed out character in this story. Despite that being the case, he still has a fairly simple motivation. He needs to pull off this last job so he can go home to his children. If he fails, he'll be arrested on the spot. All of this information is spoon-fed to the audience through one of the many exposition dumps in this narrative. This movie is absolutely full of scenes with nothing but pure exposition. And while this is definitely a problem, I also think it was unavoidable. When introducing a concept that is likely not only unheard of, but perhaps even unfathomable to an audience, you have to spend time explaining the ins and outs of it in order for it to be understood. Despite that, many still leave Inception confused. To be completely honest, I don't think that was the film's fault though. There is an effort made to explain everything, and the exposition scenes are made as interesting as possible by breaking them up with jokes or stunning visuals. Unfortunately, the one part that did become stale and even slightly annoying was Ariadne. Ariadne's sole purpose is moving the plot forward, and because of that, she can become slightly annoying. Every single scene she's in is just questions on questions. The problem is that the questions she's asking are the exact same ones I have, so I don't know how else this information could have been delivered. The heist format does help, since heist movies almost always have lots of time dedicated to exposition, but there's just too much information to cover in Inception for it to have been conveyed completely naturally. That's just what happens when you introduce a complex new concept to audiences. I view it more as an unfortunate byproduct, rather than an actual knock against the film that heavily affects its quality. Speaking of it being a new concept though, that's not entirely true. The most serious complaint made against Inception is the allegation that it ripped off a 2006 anime movie called Paprika. Most of the time I hear people discuss this, however, they simply say, yes, Inception ripped off Paprika, or no, Inception didn't rip off Paprika. They never get into the how. So today I made a list of all the similarities I found between Paprika and Inception. And also I'll give my verdict on whether or not Nolan stole anything from Paprika. Now, if I miss anything, let me know in the comments. Firstly, the entire concept of dream sharing through a piece of tech. Secondly, there's a scene in both where an elevator is used to go to different dreams. Third, the concept of dreams within dreams is present in both. And fourth, there's a line where it's stated that those who use the dream sharing device can no longer dream without them. Now, people have found other similarities, like the mirrors and hallway scenes. However, the context between these moments is completely different. So given the evidence, do I believe that Inception was inspired by Paprika, or even entirely plagiarized it as some claim? Well, plagiarized, no, but inspired, I'll definitely say maybe. I think it's safe to conclude that Nolan saw Paprika at least once. Some shots are simply too similar to be purely coincidental. However, I do hesitate to say that Inception was conceptually inspired by Paprika. My problem is this: I had thought of the concept of dream sharing long before I had watched Inception. I've always hated when people tell me a story of something that happened in their dream, because the stories are often impossible to follow, nonsensical, and never have a real conclusion. So I've always wished that I could just see the dream rather than them trying to relay it to me. My point in bringing this up is just that dream sharing isn't a unique concept. Also, dreams within dreams, not a very unique concept. I'm sure we've all woken up from a dream before, and for a second nothing feels quite real, almost as if we're still in a dream. Dreams within dreams is a fairly common idea, and again was something both myself and I'm sure many others had thought of long before seeing either film. Those concepts alone wouldn't be enough for me to say that Nolan had ever seen Paprika before writing Inception. The thought that he may have seen it comes in with the more subtle similarities, namely the elevator and the idea that those who use the dream machine can no longer dream naturally after a while. Those concepts are just so specific that I have a hard time believing that Nolan never even heard of Paprika before. Either way, both are nothing more than small details within their narratives. Paprika and Inception could not be more different from a narrative perspective, and the assertion that Nolan ripped off Paprika is frankly ridiculous. Now, for context, I'm a big anime fan. My profile picture is from Dragon Ball, my channel banner is also a Dragon Ball reference, and even the font for my footnotes comes from Cowboy Bebop, the greatest anime ever made. So what I say next, I say from experience. Anime fans have a tendency to get overprotective over their favorite shows and movies. They often gatekeep their favorite franchises and look for references where there aren't any. Because of this almost underdog mentality, where they feel that they're often overlooked and ignored, they go slightly overboard when it comes to defending their favorite shows. I'm of course not speaking for everyone, but I'm just saying that I feel this is the case for Paprika. There aren't nearly as many similarities between Paprika and Inception than they'd have you believe. Now don't get me wrong, I adore Paprika. I wholeheartedly believe that the most unfortunate part of this debate is that Paprika almost never gets brought up outside of the context of Inception, and it really should. It's a phenomenal movie. It fundamentally understands the purpose of entertainment and cinema specifically, in a way most films don't. It's also free on YouTube right now for anyone who hasn't seen it and is curious. I'd love to talk about it in its entirety someday, so if that's a video you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. Either way though, my final verdict? Maybe Inception was slightly inspired by Paprika, but in reality, it doesn't really matter. While both movies may have similar concepts, the themes and narratives are entirely different. Both films are excellent and available for everyone to enjoy. I mentioned earlier how the characters are relatively simple aside from our protagonists, but I don't view this as a bad thing. Of course, with the concept and narrative being as complex as they are, there wasn't much space for character depth. But I still think that what we got out of our protagonist is more than sufficient. I mentioned the ending earlier, and the music is fantastic in that scene, but obviously the story is essential in creating that catharsis. Throughout this narrative, our protagonist is hunted by visions of his deceased wife, who's played by Marion Cotillard, and she is phenomenal in the role. She's equal parts terrifying and fascinating. Since she is so intertwined with our protagonist, and for all intents and purposes serves as the antagonist in our story, it was essential that this role was done right, and Marion Cotillard absolutely delivers. The scene where Cobb finally admits to first having done Inception on her is shocking, and is a perfect twist in my eyes. Cobb's guilt is briefly foreshadowed to the audience in the scene where he thanks Ariadne for not asking whether he killed his wife, and in the scene where Ariadne tells him that the idea that killed her wasn't his fault, to which he visibly reacts. That's part of what makes this twist perfect for this kind of film. A story like this isn't built around a central twist, so if you're going to have a plot twist, it shouldn't fundamentally shake up our understanding of this narrative or this world. It should also be foreshadowed well, perhaps even to the extent that an observant viewer can put the pieces together on their own beforehand. While yes, the concept that Cobb inadvertently killed his wife is a big deal, it doesn't fundamentally change our understanding of his motivations or what's at stake. The goal is still the same. All that's accomplished is that we're now more emotionally invested than we may have been otherwise. And Cobb's parting words to his memory of Maul offer a fitting conclusion to that plotline. Speaking of plot twist, the final shot can also be considered a plot twist depending on your interpretation. Before we get to that though, let's briefly talk about totems. Their function within the narrative is cool, however their function as a motif is far more significant in my eyes. The top represents a doubt within our protagonist's mind, a fundamental doubt in his reality. It also represents his connection to Maul, and I love when movies have motifs like this, where an object holds way more emotional significance than would be expected. One movie that did this frustratingly well was The Flash with a can of tomatoes. That's a terrible movie, but that was a fantastic motif. The ability to attach such strong emotions to a simple object is an impressive feat of storytelling, and allows for such powerful moments as the final scene in Inception. After finally arriving home, Cobb spins the top to make sure that this is reality. After seeing his kids' faces, however, he runs from the table and greets them. As he hugs his children, the camera pans down to the table to reveal the top still spinning, with just the slightest wobble before we suddenly cut to black. It forces the audience to ask the question as to whether Cobb is in reality. This is a hotly debated topic, but to be completely honest, it never really interested me. I do believe that he is in reality, but even if he isn't, that's not the point the story is trying to make. The point is that it doesn't matter. Him leaving the top to spin shows the progress he's made during this narrative. He's let go of that doubt in his world, and most importantly, that guilt over his wife's death. He is now, more than ever, present. Of course, physically present for his children, but also mentally and emotionally present within the reality he's chosen. Much like Memento, this movie has that commentary on objective versus subjective reality, which I spoke about during the Memento video, so I won't rehash that here. I'll just say this. The stance Inception takes is one of indifference. Whereas Memento showed how dangerous subjective reality could be, Inception states that it doesn't really matter. Reality is what we choose it to be, both films providing different takes on the same issue, interestingly being from the same director only a decade apart. Inception was the first time that Christopher Nolan himself was the draw of the film, and it didn't disappoint financially or critically. The Dark Knight was obviously incredibly successful, but Inception proved that Nolan was a brand by himself, and this of course gave him more freedom than he had ever had up to this point in his career. Nolan projects would continue to get bigger as time went on, however to this day, I consider Inception to be the quintessential Nolan project. When people make jokes about how every Nolan movie has particular characteristics, each one of these can be found in Inception. It has a complex narrative, well-spoken characters, themes that leave you thinking, and stunning effects. Inception even messes with time, as is typical in a Nolan story. With these positive traits, however, also come some of the negative aspects of Nolan's filmmaking style, namely his lengthy and unnatural exposition and underwhelming female characters. Firstly, the female characters. While Maul is interesting, she is more of a concept than a character, and Ariadne is really given nothing to do except ask questions, which makes her borderline unlikable at times. Perhaps if this task was spread out between more characters like Saito and Yusuf, it would have given Ariadne a little more variety. And that ties into the second big complaint Inception gets, along with most of Nolan's filmography, the lengthy exposition dumps. And as I've stated, yes, these are a problem, but it's a necessary evil. People always complain about how there's no unique movies nowadays, how everything's a sequel, remake, reboot, or spin-off. In order to get an audience invested in a new story though, you have to tell them about it, especially one as complex as Inception. I don't see any way around this issue for this particular narrative, unfortunately. This is the price of new ideas. Nolan also often gets complaints about how he's too literal and too logical. Personally, he's always been one of my favorite directors, and I've never noticed this being an issue with his stories. However, I have to say that the terms too literal and too logical have also been used to describe me, so that's probably why I don't see a problem with it. Despite the criticism Inception receives from a vocal minority, it's still one of the most beloved films ever made, and it only further established Christopher Nolan as the premier filmmaker of his generation. He proved with Inception that he wasn't reliant on a franchise like Batman to be successful. He was capable of not only telling unique stories, but also drawing an audience to them. However, for his next project, he would be stepping back into Gotham City. The Dark Knight was incredibly successful, grossing over $1 billion worldwide. Naturally, a sequel would soon follow, and it would prove to be Nolan's biggest film yet. 4 years after The Dark Knight, the much anticipated sequel would release, The Dark Knight Rises. And that's what we'll be taking a look at next time. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.